They didn't reject you. They avoided depth. And that distinction matters more than you were ever taught. Because rejection suggests you weren't enough. Avoidance tells a different truth. You reached a place they couldn't follow. And instead of naming that, they pulled back, quietly, subtly, in ways that made you question yourself. You didn't feel abandoned. You felt unmet. That feeling didn't come from insecurity. It came from perception. Your body noticed the moment. Emotional presence stopped deepening. When conversations stayed safe. When vulnerability stopped being reciprocal. When closeness had a ceiling. You weren't allowed to touch. You felt it before you understood it. And because it wasn't dramatic, you minimized it. You told yourself they were just stressed, just busy, just processing. You gave context instead of naming impact. That's how depth gets avoided, without anyone doing anything wrong. You weren't asking for intensity. You were asking for mutuality, for emotional entry, for someone to stay present when things moved past the surface. But depth requires capacity, and not everyone has it, especially people who learned early that emotions complicate safety. So when the relationship reached a deeper layer, they didn't reject you. They stalled. They went neutral. They became vague. They offered less, while saying everything was fine. And you felt the gap. That gap is not imagined. It's the space between your openness and their limitation. You tried to bridge it. You slowed yourself down. You softened your truth. You edited your needs. You made depth less threatening, so they wouldn't disappear. That's not because you lacked boundaries. It's because you were bonded to the version of them that almost met you, and almost as dangerous, because it keeps you hopeful, while emotionally alone. Avoidance doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like distance, disguised as calm. It looks like consistency, without intimacy. It looks like effort, without emotional risk. And women blame themselves for that. They think, if I were less emotional, if I were easier, if I didn't need so much. But depth is not a flaw. It's a capacity. And when someone avoids it, it doesn't mean you asked for too much. It means you reached a layer they never learned how to stay in. Your nervous system responded accordingly. You became alert. You started monitoring. You questioned your instincts. Because emotional avoidance creates confusion, not clarity. There's no clear ending, no obvious harm, just a slow pulling back. That leaves you holding the weight, alone. That's why this hurt differently. Not sharp, dull, disorienting. Because the rejection was never spoken. It was felt, and your body kept trying to make sense of it. You don't heal this by explaining yourself better. You heal it by trusting what you noticed. Depth doesn't disappear accidentally. It's avoided intentionally by people who can't stay present when things get real. And the moment you see that, the self-doubt loosens, not because they change, but because you stop turning their limitation into your reflection. You don't need to explain why the connection felt uneven, why you started pulling back, why something shifted in you before anything happened, why your body stopped relaxing. People who can meet depth notice without being told. They feel the change because they are inside the exchange. But when someone avoids depth, they rely on explanation. They ask questions that sound curious, but feel hollow. Why are you different? Why are you quiet? Why are you distant? Not to understand, to delay, to keep the surface intact, without entering what's underneath. Because depth requires responsibility, and responsibility is what avoidance is designed to escape. You weren't confusing. You were responding to a lack of emotional entry. You felt the moment. You started reaching further than they were willing to go. You felt the pause, After vulnerability, the change in energy, the subtle withdrawal, that couldn't be confronted because nothing was technically wrong. That's where women start explaining. They try to make the feeling reasonable. They turn sensation into story. They soften truth into palatable language because they've been taught that clarity must be justified. But depth doesn't need justification. It needs presence. When someone avoids depth, they don't say no. They stall. They intellectualize. They keep things vague enough that you can't name the absence. And that ambiguity pushes the work onto you. You start tracking, monitoring, adjusting. You become the interpreter of their emotional limitations. That's when self-doubt enters. Not because you're insecure, but because your nervous system is trying to orient. Inside inconsistency, you ask yourself, am I reading too much into this? Am I expecting something unrealistic? Am I making this heavy? Those questions didn't come from nowhere. They came from being met halfway and told it was enough. Avoidant depth doesn't reject loudly. It creates a ceiling. You feel it when conversations don't expand, when emotional honesty is met with neutrality, when your openness is acknowledged but not entered. And instead of them naming that limit, you're left carrying the discomfort. So you shrink, you pause, you stop bringing certain parts of yourself forward. Not because you want to, because you're adapting. Adaptation is not intuition failing. It's intuition responding to a constraint. And this is where women get stuck. They think clarity comes from communication, but clarity doesn't come from explaining to someone who benefits from not understanding, because misunderstanding keeps responsibility off them. If they can frame you as unclear, they never have to face their own avoidance. So they keep asking, what do you need? What do you mean? What changed? While staying exactly where they are. Those aren't questions. They're distance maintenance tools. Depth would require them to say, I can't meet you there. But avoidance avoids honesty. So it creates confusion instead. And confusion keeps you busy. Busy explaining. Busy clarifying. Busy proving your feelings are valid. Meanwhile, nothing actually changes. This is why your body got tired. Not from loving, from translating, from carrying the emotional weight of something that was never mutual. Depth doesn't require convincing. It doesn't need timing. It doesn't need endless discussion. It either exists or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, your body knows before your mind accepts it. That knowing didn't make you cold. It made you honest. You didn't become distant. You became discerning. And discernment often looks like withdrawal. To people who relied on your overgiving, you didn't pull away to punish. You pulled away to stop bleeding quietly. Because depth isn't dramatic. It's responsive. It's reciprocal. It moves toward truth instead of away from it. And once you see avoidance clearly, you stop asking why you weren't chosen. You start seeing that you were simply no longer willing to stay shallow for someone else's comfort. Once you stop explaining yourself, something becomes obvious. Depth was never the problem. Your willingness to stay shallow was, because as long as you adapted, the relationship could continue without ever changing. You did the emotional stretching. You did the translating. You did the waiting. And they stayed comfortable. Avoidance feeds on comfort. It survives when someone else carries the discomfort. So when you finally stopped adjusting, it felt like distance to them. Not because you withdrew love, but because you withdrew labor. You stopped filling the gaps. You stopped smoothing over silence. You stopped offering reassurance. You weren't receiving. And suddenly, the dynamic felt different. Not to you, to them. Because depth requires participation. And participation requires exposure. Exposure means being seen. Being seen means accountability, and avoidance will always choose distance over accountability. This is why they framed you as changed, as colder, as harder to reach, because your nervous system stopped compensating. You weren't less loving. You were less available. For imbalance, you stopped meeting them where they wouldn't meet you. That's not withdrawal. That's alignment. But alignment disrupts unequal dynamics. It removes the illusion that everything was fine, because everything was only fine when you were doing more. Once you stopped, the lack of depth became visible. And visibility is what avoidance fears most. You didn't demand more. You simply stopped offering less of yourself. And that's when the truth surfaced. Not through confrontation, through contrast. Your calm exposed the gap. Your silence revealed the imbalance. Your self-trust removed the confusion. Avoidant depth can't survive clarity. It needs ambiguity. It needs you questioning yourself. It needs you explaining what shouldn't require explanation. That's why when you grounded, they felt unsettled. Not because you hurt them, because you stopped carrying them. Depth doesn't chase. It doesn't convince. It doesn't overfunction. It responds. And when response is missing, it withdraws without drama. That's what you did. You didn't punish. You regulated. You listened to the moment. Your body stopped feeling safe, offering more. That moment matters. Because it's the moment. You stopped confusing availability with intimacy. You realized someone can be consistent and still avoid depth. Someone can care and still not be capable. Someone can stay and still never fully arrive. That realization hurts, but it also clarifies. It removes the fantasy that if you just stayed open enough, they'd follow. They weren't following. They were standing still, and you were walking toward yourself. That's why this ending felt quiet. No explosion, no dramatic exit, just a steady reclaiming of your energy. You didn't lose them. You stopped losing yourself. And once that happens, avoidance has nowhere to hide. When depth is avoided long enough, your body makes the decision before your mind does. It stops leaning, not out of punishment, out of protection. That's the moment. Most women misunderstand themselves. They think they're shutting down. They think they're becoming cold. They think something is wrong. But what's actually happening is recalibration. Your nervous system is no longer volunteering for emotional imbalance. That's not loss. That's intelligence. Depth doesn't disappear suddenly. It fades when it's unsupported. And when you stop forcing it to exist, you don't feel dramatic relief. You feel steadiness. The constant inner dialogue quiets. The urge to explain dissolves. The pull to chase clarity disappears. Not because you got answers, but because you stopped needing them. You realize something essential. Depth doesn't require convincing. If it has to be negotiated, it's already absent. If it has to be explained, it's already avoided. And when you accept that, you stop personalizing what was never yours to carry. You don't rewrite the past. You don't villainize them. You don't minimize yourself. You simply see the dynamic clearly. They weren't withholding to hurt you. They were protecting themselves from what intimacy would require. And you were protecting yourself by no longer reaching where there was no response. That's not rejection. That's differentiation. You didn't fail to be chosen. You stopped choosing to stay where depth had no place to land. And once you stop forcing depth, you reclaim something quiet, but powerful. Your self-trust. You trust the moment. Your body pulled back. You trust the fatigue that followed overgiving. You trust the calm that arrived with distance, not numbness. Calm. That calm isn't emptiness. It's resolution. It's your system saying, I don't need to explain anymore. And from that place, You don't rush into the next connection. You don't overcorrect. You don't harden. You observe. You listen. You notice who meets depth without being asked, who stays present when things move past the surface, who doesn't require you to shrink to be chosen. That's discernment, not walls, not fear. And if this landed in you without needing explanation, that's your body recognizing truth. You don't have to act on it today. You don't have to name it out loud. Just let it recalibrate you. Depth isn't something you chase. It's something you stop abandoning yourself for. And when you do that, everything aligns quietly. If this named something you've been carrying alone, stay with that recognition. It's not asking you to rush. It's asking you to trust what you already know.